Well, right now what we're going to do is we're going to hear from Patrick McMillan. Patrick is with the Biological Sciences Department here at Clemson University, and he is the gentleman here that gets the materials that need to be identified. If we can't figure out what it is, it goes to Patrick. Dr. Bill Stringer, who heads up the Native Plant Society for South Carolina, says that Patrick can identify anything. He can even identify a plant from another planet. I don't know about that, but he does seem to be awfully good at what he does. And we welcome Patrick here. You probably know him more for his work with the program Expeditions, which is on ETV every Sunday evening. So Patrick, tell us a little bit more about today.
Thank you very much, George. I want to thank George, Steve, and everyone who's worked on this Cogongrass project, pulling this together, because I can tell you I had the pleasure and I'll say the scourge of working in Central Florida back in the early 1990s, and Cogongrass was such a huge problem in Florida, continues to be such a huge problem in Florida, and it's hard to underestimate how important it is to keep this plant out of South Carolina. Unfortunately, with Cogongrass, when you see Cogongrass the first time, it's already almost too late. This plant it impacts so many more parts of not just economic but also natural diversity than any other invasive exotic that we have in the southeast, that I think it probably is the most important invasive exotic to keep from spreading north into South Carolina. A couple things that haven't been mentioned about the invasibility of Cogongrass. It's unique among the invasives that we have in South Carolina at this time because it's actually a species that can invade intact longleaf pine ecosystems. And not only does it invade these intact ecosystems, but it flourishes there because it's adapted to fire, it reproduces well after fire, and it displaces species in sandhill, savanna, even wetland habitats that have a similar life form. So things like switchgrass. When I worked in Central Florida, switchgrass was a species that was studied at Fairchild where I worked, being displaced by Imperatus cylindrica. So we're talking about a habitat that harbors most of the rare plant species in South Carolina, the longleaf pine, wiregrass and longleaf pine boostem habitats that we're fortunate to still have some of in South Carolina, harbor most of the rare species, and it also is the most invasible place by Cogongrass. So it's really important you guys keep an eye out for this plant, not just down there, but up here. And I'll go on, Cogongrass's identification Cogongrass, we can go on to the PowerPoint. Imperatus cylindrica is one of the most easy grasses that you'll ever have to identify. Luckily for us, it's very easy. Now, if that plant is in flower, as George has said, as Steve has said, as Robin has said, that fluffy white bloom is nearly indistinguishable. I mean, there's hardly anything else you could mistake for Cogongrass when in flower. The problem with that is that a lot of times when we can still do something about Cogongrass is when it's in small or young stands and not in flower. So I'm going to try to bring out for you today some characteristics, vegetative and otherwise, that we can use to identify Cogongrass at any time during its life cycle. Grass identification scares people. I see it in my classroom a lot. When I start to cover grasses, people start to stop listening. And it's because there are so many grasses, it's because so many grasses look alike, and it's because they generally have complicated flowers. They don't put their parts out there like a lot of other flowering plants do in big, conspicuous petals or sepals. They don't have a lot of variability in the way their leaves look. So you have to look a bit closer at grasses to really identify what you're looking at. Why is this important? Well, I think it's very important with Cogongrass because, as I've already stated, Cogongrass has a tendency to grow where we have other rare species. So if we're treating a site for Cogongrass, we better make sure that we're actually treating Cogongrass. And I've got beech vitex up here as another example because it's a great example of people getting energized and excited about going out and stopping an invasion, but in the meantime, in the process of trying to stop the invasion, without having the proper training to identify the plant, you can actually harm rare native species like sea beech amaranth or species which are native like the railroad vine that I had up on the screen there, or beech morning glory, Pomea pescapri. If you're not careful and you don't distinguish between those two species, you may actually be removing a native species from the habitat. So first thing I'd encourage you to do, if you think you've found Cogongrass, get it into your extension office, get it sent into Clemson, and let's take a look at it and make sure before we jump the gun. Secondly, we have to take a pretty close look at a few of the terms that I'm going to throw out today. And it's just a real crude drawing here, which I'm going to mark up a little bit. A few of the features that we need to pay attention to when we're trying to identify Cogongrass are the rhizome. Rhizome is just an underground stem. Now, Cogongrass, unlike a lot of other grasses that we have in the state, produces a calling stem, which is the main growth point of grass. But that calling stem is usually hidden by leaf bases and sheaths of leaf bases. So the only actual elongated stem that Cogongrass is producing that's visible is that rhizome. And the rhizome is a good characteristic to identify it by. We're going to start looking at the rhizome. We're going to go on to looking at what we call the blade, which is simply just the leaf of the grass above the sheath, which is the sheathing part that cradles the stem. We're going to look at nodes, internodes, and then we're going to take a quick look at the inflorescence. So the first thing, oops, I guess I need to click to get off my, oops, each one. All right. So the first thing that I would like to point out about Cogongrass that can be used to differentiate it vegetatively from other grasses that we have in South Carolina is the fact that the nodes of Cogongrass, these knee-like structures that you see, which are actually sort of the joints in the stem of grasses, are generally not visible on Cogongrass. That's because the sheathing portion of the leaf generally hides those nodes. So when you're looking especially at young Cogongrass, most of the leaves will be upright, and most of those sheaths will be hiding these sort of knee-like nodes that most grasses have. So when you see in literature, and when we talk about nodes, we're talking about that point where the leaf junction is, base of the sheath. When we talk about internodes, we're talking about that distance in between the nodes on a grass stem. Another feature of grasses in general is that they display ligules. And a ligule is found at the base of a leaf. It's not specific just to grasses, but it's mostly found in grasses. Ligules are basically pieces of tissue that extend up from the base of the leaf, of the blade portion of the leaf, and we're not really sure what the function is. It may be to keep water from draining down into the hollow portion of the sheath. It may be protective for other reasons. But the collar, the ligule, those are very important features to notice when you're trying to identify grasses. Some grasses have membranaceous ligules, like you see circled here. Other grasses, a lot of our panic grasses, for instance, and Cogongrass, have ligules that are basically a collar of cilia, or hairs, that stick up at the sheath blade junction. So the ligule is the second thing to look at. I'm going to skip right on past that one. The third thing, and the most complicated thing about grasses, which I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about, is the form of the flower. Grasses have inflorescence units that are reduced and highly modified into something called a spikelet. They don't have petals, they don't have sepals, they have a series of bracts that subtend a male flower or female flower. You don't have